Part 3, Swann in Love, Section 19. Always ready to believe in the truth of what he hoped, if it was only Odette's way of behaving to him that left room for doubt, he would fling himself greedily upon her words. "You can if you like," he would tell her. And he tried to explain to her that to comfort him, to control him, to make him work would be a noble task, to which numbers of other women ask for nothing better than to be allowed to devote themselves, though it is only fair to add that in those other women's hands the noble task would have seemed to Swann nothing more than an indiscreet and intolerable usurpation of his freedom of action. If she didn't love me just a little, he told himself, she would not wish to have me altered. To alter me, she will have to see me more often. And so he was able to trace, in these faults which she found in him, a proof at least of her interest, perhaps even of her love. And in fact she gave him so little now of the last that he was obliged to regard as proofs of her interest in him the various things which, every now and then, she forbade him to do. One day she announced that she did not care for his coachman, who, she thought, was perhaps setting Swann against her, and anyhow did not show that promptness and deference to Swann's orders which she would have liked to see. She felt that he wanted to hear her say, "Don't have him again when you come to me," just as he might have wanted her to kiss him. So being in a good temper, she said it, and he was deeply moved. That evening, when talking to Monsieur de Charlus, with whom he had the satisfaction of being able to speak of her openly, for the most trivial remarks that he uttered now, even to people who had never heard of her, had always some sort of reference to Odette, he said to him, "I believe all the same that she loves me. She is so nice to me now, and she certainly takes an interest in what I do." And if, when he was starting off for her house, getting into his carriage with a friend whom he was to drop somewhere on the way, his friend said, "Hello! That isn't Loredan on the box," with what melancholy joy would Swann answer him, "Oh, good heavens, no! I can tell you I daren't take Loredan when I go to the Rue La Pérouse. Odette doesn't like me to have Loredan. She thinks he doesn't suit me. What on earth is one to do? Women, you know, women. Oh, dear fellow, she would be furious. Oh, Lord, yes. I've only to take Rémi there. I should never hear the last of it." These new manners, indifferent, listless, irritable, which Odette now adopted with Swann, undoubtedly made him suffer. But he did not realize how much he suffered, since it had been with a regular progression, day after day, that Odette had chilled towards him. It was only by directly contrasting what she was to day with what she had been at first that he could have measured the extent of the change that had taken place. Now this change was his deep, his secret wound, which pained him day and night, and whenever he felt that his thoughts were straying too near it, he would quickly turn them into another channel for fear of being made to suffer too keenly. He might say to himself in a vague way, "There was a time when Odette loved me more," but he never formed any definite picture of that time. Just as he had in his study a cupboard at which he contrived never to look, which he turned aside to avoid passing whenever he entered or left the room, because in one of its drawers he had locked away the chrysanthemum which she had given him on one of those first evenings when he had taken her home in his carriage, and the letters in which she said, "Why did you not forget your heart also? I should never have let you have that back," and "At whatever hour of the day or night you may need me, just send me a word, and dispose of me as you please." So there was a place in his heart to which he would never allow his thoughts to trespass too near, forcing them, if need be, to evade it by a long course of reasoning, so that they should not have to pass within reach of it, the place in which lingered his memories of happy days. But his so meticulous prudence was defeated one evening when he had gone out to a party. It was at the Marquise de Saint Euverte, on the last for that season of the evenings on which she invited people to listen to the musicians who would serve later on for her charity concerts. Swann, who had intended to go to each of the previous evenings in turn, but had never been able to make up his mind, received, while he was dressing for this party, a visit from the Baronne de Charlus, who came with an offer to go with him to the Marquise's if his company could be of any use in helping Swann not to feel quite so bored when he got there, to be a little less unhappy. But Swann had thanked him with, "You can't conceive how glad I should be of your company. But the greatest pleasure that you can give me will be if you will go instead to see Odette. You know what a splendid influence you have over her. I don't suppose she'll be going anywhere this evening, unless she goes to see her old dressmaker, and I'm sure she would be delighted if you went with her there. In any case, you'll find her at home before then. Try to keep her amused, and also to give her a little sound advice. If you could arrange something for to-morrow which would please her, something that we could all three do together. Try to put out a feel or two for the summer, see if there's anything she wants to do, a cruise that we might all three take. Anything you can think of. I don't count upon seeing her to-night, myself. Still, if she would like me to come, or if you find a loophole, you've only to send me a line at Madame de Saint Ouverte's up till midnight. After that I shall be here. Ever so many thanks for all you are doing for me. You know what I feel about you." His friend promised to go and do as Swann wished, as soon as he had deposited him at the door of the Saint Ouvert house, where he arrived soothed by the thought that Monsieur de Charlus would be spending the evening in the Rue La Pérouse, but in a state of melancholy indifference to everything that did not involve Odette, and in particular to the details of fashionable life, a state which invested them with a charm that is to be found in anything which, being no longer an object of our desire, appears to us in its own guise. On alighting from his carriage, in the foreground of that fictitious summary of their domestic existence which hostesses are pleased to offer to their guests on ceremonial occasions, and in which they show a great regard for accuracy of costume and setting, Swann was amused to discover the heirs and successors of Balzac's tigers, now grooms, who normally followed their mistress when she walked abroad, but now, hatted and booted, were posted out of doors, in front of the house on the gravelled drive, or outside the stables, as gardeners might be drawn up for inspection at the ends of their several flower beds. The peculiar tendency which he had always had to look for analogies between living people and the portraits in galleries reasserted itself here, but in a more positive and more general form. It was society as a whole, now that he was detached from it, which presented itself to him in a series of pictures. In the cloak-room, into which in the old days, when he was still a man of fashion, he would have gone in his overcoat, to emerge from it in evening dress, but without any impression of what had occurred there, his mind having been, during the minute or two that he had spent in it, either still at the party which he had just left, or already at the party into which he was just about to be ushered. He now noticed for the first time, roused by the unexpected arrival of so belated a guest, the scattered pack of splendid, effortless animals, the enormous footmen who were drowsing here and there upon benches and chests, until, pointing their noble greyhound profiles, they towered upon their feet and gathered in a circle round about him. One of them, of a particularly ferocious aspect, and not unlike the headsman in certain Renaissance pictures which represent executions, tortures, and the like, advanced upon him with an implacable air to take his things. But the harshness of his steely glare was compensated by the softness of his cotton gloves, so effectively that as he approached Swann he seemed to be exhibiting at once an utter contempt for his person and the most tender regard for his hat. He took it with a care to which the precision of his movements imparted something that was almost over fastidious, and with a delicacy that was rendered almost touching by the evidence of his splendid strength. Then he passed it to one of his satellites, a novice and timid, who was expressing the panic that overpowered him by casting furious glances in every direction, and displayed all the dumb agitation of a wild animal in the first hours of its captivity. A few feet away, a strapping great lad in livery stood musing, motionless, statuesque, useless, like that purely decorative warrior whom one sees in the most tumultuous of Mantegna's paintings, lost in dreams, leaning upon his shield, while all around him are fighting and bloodshed and death. Detached from the group of his companions who were thronging about Swann, he seemed as determined to remain unconcerned in the scene which he followed vaguely with his cruel greenish eyes, as if it had been the massacre of the innocents or the martyrdom of St. James. He seemed precisely to have sprung from that vanished race, if indeed it ever existed, save in the reredos of San Zeno and the frescoes of the Eremitani, where Swann had come in contact with it, and where it still dreams, fruit of the impregnation of a classical statue by some one of the master's Paduan models, or of Albrecht Dürer's Saxons; and the locks of his reddish hair, crinkled by nature, but glued to his head by brilliantine, were treated broadly as they are in that Greek sculpture which the Mantuan painter never ceased to study, and which, if in its creator's purpose it represents but man, manages at least to extract from man's simple outlines such a variety of richness, borrowed as it were from the whole of animated nature, that a head of hair, by the glossy undulation and beak-like points of its curls, or in the overlaying of the florid triple diadem of its brushed tresses, can suggest at once a bunch of seaweed, a brood of fledgling doves, a bed of hyacinths, and a serpent's writhing back. Others again, no less colossal, were disposed upon the steps of a monumental staircase, which, by their decorative presence and marmorean immobility, were made worthy to be named, like that god-crowned ascent in the palace of the Doges, the staircase of the giants, and on which Swann now set foot, saddened by the thought that Odette had never climbed it. Ah, with what joy would he, on the other hand, have raced up the dark, evil-smelling break-neck flights to the little dressmaker's, in whose attic he would so gladly have paid the price of a weekly stage box at the opera for the right to spend the evening there when Odette came, and other days too, for the privilege of talking about her, of living among people whom she was in the habit of seeing when he was not there, and who, on that account, seemed to keep secret among themselves some part of the life of his mistress more real, more inaccessible, and more mysterious than anything that he knew. Whereas upon that pestilential, enviable staircase to the old dressmaker's, since there was no other, no service stair in the building, one saw in the evening outside every door an empty, unwashed milk can, set out in readiness for the morning round upon the door mat, on the despicable, enormous staircase which Swann was at that moment climbing, on either side of him at different levels, before each anfractuosity made in its walls by the window of the porter's lodge, or the entrance to a set of rooms, representing the departments of indoor service which they controlled, and doing homage for them to the guests, a gatekeeper, a major domo, a steward, worthy men who spent the rest of the week in semi-independence in their own domains, dined there by themselves like small shopkeepers, and might tomorrow lapse to the plebeian service of some successful doctor or industrial magnate, scrupulous in carrying out to the letter all the instructions that had been heaped upon them before they were allowed to don the brilliant livery which they wore only at long intervals, and in which they did not feel altogether at their ease, stood each in the arcade of his doorway, their splendid pomp tempered by a democratic good fellowship, like saints in their niches, and a gigantic usher, dressed Swiss guard fashion, like the beadle in a church, struck the pavement with his staff as each fresh arrival passed him. Coming to the top of the staircase, up which he had been followed by a servant with a pallid countenance, and a small pigtail clubbed at the back of his head, like one of Goya's sacristans or a Tabelian in an old play, Swann passed by an office in which the lackeys, seated like notaries before their massive registers, rose solemnly to their feet and inscribed his name. He next crossed a little hall which, just as certain rooms are arranged by their owners to serve as the setting for a single work of art from which they take their name, and, in their studied bareness, contain nothing else besides, displayed to him as he entered it like some priceless effigy by Benvenuto Cellini of an armed watchman, a young footman, his body slightly bent forward, rearing above his crimson gorget and even more crimson face, from which seemed to burst forth torrents of fire, timidity, and zeal, who, as he pierced the Aubusson tapestries that screened the door of the room in which the music was being given, with his impetuous, vigilant, desperate gaze, appeared with a soldierly impassibility or a supernatural faith, an allegory of alarums, incarnation of alertness, commemoration of a riot, to be looked out, angel or sentinel, from the tower of dungeons or cathedral, for the approach of the enemy or for the hour of judgment. Swann had only now to enter the concert room, the doors of which were thrown open to him by an usher loaded with chains, who bowed low before him as though tendering to him the keys of a conquered city. But he thought of the house in which at that very moment he might have been, if Odette had but permitted, and the remembered glimpse of an empty milk can upon a door mat wrung his heart. He speedily recovered his sense of the general ugliness of the human male, when on the other side of the tapestry curtain the spectacle of the servants gave place to that of the guests. But even this ugliness of faces, which of course were mostly familiar to him, seemed something new and uncanny, now that their features, instead of being to him symbols of practical utility in the identification of this or that man, who until then had represented merely so many pleasures to be sought after, boredoms to be avoided, or courtesies to be acknowledged, were at rest, measurable by aesthetic coordinates alone, in the autonomy of their curves and angles. And in these men, in the thick of whom Swann now found himself packed, there was nothing, even to the monocle which many of them wore, and which previously would, at the most, have enabled Swann to say that so and so wore a monocle, which, no longer restricted to the general connotation of a habit, the same in all of them, did not now strike him with a sense of individuality in each. Perhaps because he did not regard General de Froberville and the Marquis de Broc, who were talking together just inside the door, as anything more than two figures in a picture, whereas they were the old and useful friends who had put him up for the Jockey Club, and had supported him in duels, the general's monocle stuck like a shell splinter in his common, scarred, victorious, overbearing face, in the middle of a forehead which it left half blinded, like the single-eyed flashing front of the Cyclops, appeared to Swann as a monstrous wound which it might have been glorious to receive, but which it was certainly not decent to expose, while that which M. de Broc wore as a festive badge, with his pearl gray gloves, his crush hat, and white tie, substituting it for the familiar pair of glasses, as Swann himself did when he went out to places, bore, glued to its other side, like a specimen prepared on a slide for the microscope, an infinitesimal gaze that swarmed with friendly feeling, and never ceased to twinkle at the loftiness of ceilings, the delightfulness of parties, the interestingness of programs, and the excellence of refreshments. "Hello! You here? Why, it's ages since I've seen you," the general greeted Swann, and, noticing the look of strain on his face, and concluding that it was perhaps a serious illness that had kept him away, went on, "You're looking well, old man," while M. de Broc turned with, "My dear fellow, what on earth are you doing here?" To a society novelist, who had just fitted into the angle of eyebrow and cheek his own monocle, the sole instrument that he used in his psychological investigations and remorseless analyses of character, and who now replied with an air of mystery and importance, rolling the R, "I am observing." The Marquis de Forestal's monocle was minute and rimless, and by enforcing an incessant and painful contraction of the eye, over which it was encrusted like a superfluous cartilage, the presence of which there was inexplicable and its substance unimaginable, it gave to his face a melancholy refinement, and led women to suppose him capable of suffering terribly when in love. But that of M. de Saint Conde, girdled like Saturn with an enormous ring, was the center of gravity of a face which composed itself afresh every moment in relation to the glass, while his thrusting red nose and swollen sarcastic lips endeavored by their grimaces to rise to the level of the steady flame of wit that sparkled in the polished disk, and saw itself preferred to the most ravishing eyes in the world by the smart, depraved young women whom it set dreaming of artificial charms and a refinement of sensual bliss. And then behind him, M. de Palancy, who with his huge carp's head and goggling eyes moved slowly up and down the stream of festive gatherings, unlocking his great mandibles at every moment, as though in search of his orientation, had the air of carrying about upon his person only an accidental and perhaps purely symbolical fragment of the glass wall of his aquarium, a part intended to suggest the whole, which recalled to Swann, a fervent admirer of Giotto's vices and virtues at Padua, that injustice by whose side a leafy bough evokes the idea of the forests that enshroud his secret lair. End of Part 3, Section 19.